The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Susan Crawford buried everything she had ever known about herself and decided, with the kind of quiet desperation that only the truly lost can understand, to travel west toward a dead man she had never met. It was the spring of 1879, and the Kansas plains were still shaking off the last grip of winter when Susan stepped off the westbound stage in the town of Harlow Creek, a dust-bitten settlement that sat along the Smoky Hill River like something the frontier had coughed up and then forgotten. She was 26 years old, recently widowed herself for a matter of days, broke in all the ways that a woman in 1879 could be broke, financially, emotionally, and spiritually. And she was carrying a single carpetbag that held 3 dresses, a Bible her mother had pressed into her hands before she died, and a letter from a man named Gerald Winslow, who had written to her employer in Abilene before his death, asking that if anything should happen to him, anyone with a kind heart and capable hands might come and tend to the business of burying him properly and looking after his 2 small children until his brother returned from a cattle drive-up along the Kishom Trail. Gerald Winslow had been a schoolteacher, a gentle, ineffectual man who had come west with dreams and a young wife named Clara, who had died of typhoid the previous autumn, leaving Gerald alone with 7-year-old Ellie and 5-year-old Thomas, and a homestead 12 miles outside of Harlow Creek that had been slowly losing the battle against the earth and weather ever since Clara passed. Gerald had died of a rattlesnake bite 3 weeks after writing his letter, and the letter had made its way to Susan's employer at the boarding house in Abilene, where she had worked as a cook and housekeeper, and where she had also been living alongside her husband, Robert Crawford, a surveyor who had drunk himself into an early grave the previous month, leaving Susan with nothing but his debts and the echoing shame of a life that had never quite belonged to her in the first place. The woman who ran the boarding house, Mrs. Adeline Prewitt, had pressed the letter into Susan's hands and said, very simply, "There are children who need someone and you need somewhere to be. Go west, Susan. Make yourself useful to the world." Susan had not argued. She had packed her carpetbag and climbed onto the stage, and now here she was, standing in the dust of Harlow Creek, blinking in the sharp morning light, feeling more like a tumble of dry leaves than a human being, and wondering what on earth she was doing. The town itself was alive in the way that frontier towns always were in that era, not elegant, not comfortable, but furiously, almost aggressively alive. There were horses at every hitching post, the sound of hammers from a building going up on the far end of Main Street, 2 cowboys in trail-dusty clothes arguing outside the livery, a Chinese laundry man moving with quick, efficient steps across the street, carrying a bundle of clean linen, and a group of women gathered on the steps of the Mercantile who stopped talking the moment they noticed Susan and watched her with the frank, assessing curiosity that small towns reserve for strangers. Susan squared her shoulders, picked up her carpetbag, and walked toward the sheriff's office, which seemed like the most logical place to begin. Sheriff Hector Dales was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years looking into the sun. He read Gerald Winslow's letter carefully, his lips moving slightly with the words, and then looked up at Susan with an expression that was not unkind but was deeply skeptical. "You came all the way from Abilene," he said, "to bury a man you never met." "I came to help," Susan said. "The letter asked for someone to come." "I came." Sheriff Dales leaned back in his chair and studied her. "Gerald's already buried," he said. "Doc Fielding and the Reverend saw to that last week. The children are staying with Me Colton. She runs the bakery down the street, but Me's got 6 of her own and she's about at her wit's end. As for Patrick Winslow, Gerald's brother, he's still somewhere up along the trail. We got word out to him, but these things take time." "Then I will go to the children," Susan said, "and I will stay until their uncle comes home." The sheriff looked at her for a long, appraising moment. "You're serious," he said. "I am entirely serious," Susan said. He took her out to Me Colton's place himself, And what Susan found there broke something open inside her chest that had been locked tight for years. Ellie Winslow was sitting on a wooden chair by the window, holding a rag doll and staring at nothing with the particular blankness of a child who has been sad for so long that it has begun to feel normal. She was a thin girl with dark hair and her father's gentle eyes, and she looked at Susan the way a small, wounded animal looks at a hand it is not sure it can trust. Thomas was under the kitchen table, having apparently decided that the world was better viewed from that particular vantage point, and he was eating a biscuit with the solemn concentration of a person who has made a private decision to speak to no one. Susan crouched down on the floor beside the table. She did not try to coax Thomas out or make cheerful conversation. She simply sat down on the floor beside him, folded her skirts around her, and said, "That is a very good biscuit. May I have one?" Thomas stared at her. Then he looked at the biscuit in his hand. Then he looked at her again. "I only have one," he said. It was the first time he had spoken in 3 days. "Then I will just sit here and be jealous of yours," Susan said. Thomas considered this for a moment. Then, with the grave generosity of a 5-year-old who has just decided that a person can be trusted, he broke his biscuit in half and held out one piece to her. Susan ate it gravely. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Susan." "What is yours?" "Thomas Walter Winslow," he said, "and I am 5 years old and my papa is dead." "I know," Susan said. "I am very sorry about your papa." "Ellie cries at night," Thomas said, "but I don't because I don't know how anymore." Susan felt something shift in her chest, a deep, aching movement like a piece of ice beginning to melt after a very long winter. "Sometimes," she said gently, "when we are very sad, the crying goes away for a while. It always comes back." "That is not a bad thing." Thomas looked at her very seriously. "Are you going to go away too?" "Not until your uncle comes home," she said. "I promise." And just like that, without quite meaning to, Susan Crawford promised herself to 2 orphaned children in a stranger's kitchen in a small town on the Kansas plains, and every single thing about her life changed in an instant. Mee Colton was so relieved to hand over the care of the children that she nearly wept with gratitude. She was a broad, warm woman with flour perpetually in her hair, and she pressed Susan's hands between both of her own and said, "The Winslow homestead is a state, I warn you." Gerald wasn't much of a farmer, God rest him, but the neighbors have been keeping the animals fed, and there's enough provisions to get through a few weeks. Susan settled in at the homestead that very afternoon. It was a 2-room sod house with a wooden addition that Gerald had been building and never quite finished, set on a quarter section of land that was trying its best to grow wheat and mostly managing it, with a small barn that housed a plow horse named Biscuit, 3 cows, a flock of unhappy-looking chickens, and a one-eyed dog named Captain, who immediately decided that Susan was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and followed her everywhere she went from that moment forward. The first week was hard work, pure and simple. Susan was not a delicate woman. She had cooked and cleaned and managed a boarding house for 3 years and kept house for her difficult husband before that. And before that she had grown up on a farm in Missouri, so she knew the rhythm of early mornings and sore muscles, and the particular satisfaction of making order out of chaos. She swept and scrubbed and aired out the house, organized the provisions in the larder, mended the fence in the vegetable garden, coaxed the children into eating regular meals, and spent the evening sitting by the fire telling Ellie and Thomas stories her own mother had told her, the kind of stories that had no particular moral but were full of color and movement and the warm sense of a world that was fundamentally kind. Ellie began to talk on the 3rd day. Not much, and not easily, but she talked. She told Susan that her mother Clara had braided her hair every morning, and that no one had braided it properly since Clara died, and she did not know how to do it herself. Susan sat Ellie down the very next morning and braided her hair in 2 neat plaits, the way Susan's own mother had done it for her, and Ellie sat very still through the whole procedure and then looked at herself in the tin mirror above the washstand and said quietly, "Mama did it just like that." "Your mama had very good taste," Susan said. Ellie turned around and threw her thin arms around Susan's waist and held on for a very long time, and Susan stood there with her arms around this child, who was not hers, and felt, for the first time in months, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The neighbors came calling in that first week, as neighbors do in small, tight-knit frontier communities, bringing food and information and the particular kind of scrutiny that masks itself as friendliness. There was old Bert Halsey from the farm half a mile east, who brought a smoked ham and told Susan that Gerald had owed him $14, and he hoped that would eventually be settled. There was the Ransom family from the south, who brought 3 jars of preserved peaches and 2 of their own children, who immediately chased the chickens around the yard in a way that made Thomas laugh out loud for the first time since Susan had arrived. There was Reverend Moore from Harlow Creek, who came to check on the children and tell Susan, with great earnestness, that the Lord would provide for those who put their trust in him, which Susan received with a polite smile, and the private reservation that the Lord tended to provide most reliably for those who also worked very hard. And then there was Dolores Vega, who lived 3 miles to the north and who arrived on horseback on the 5th day with a basket of tamales and the frankest pair of dark eyes Susan had ever looked into. Dolores was perhaps 30, a Mexican woman who had married a Texas rancher named Ed Vega 20 years her senior and outlived him by 2 years, and who now ran his small ranch with the help of a single hired hand and a disposition that could have cut glass. She looked Susan up and down in the same way that Susan had looked over the homestead, taking inventory, assessing structural integrity, deciding what needed to be done. "You are the woman from Abilene," Dolores said. She said it the way one states a fact, not asking a question. "I am Susan Crawford," Susan said. "Would you like to come in? I made coffee this morning." Dolores stayed for 2 hours. By the end of it, they were friends, the real kind, the kind that form fast and hold hard, the way friendships do among women on the frontier where loneliness is always pressing at the edges of daily life and female company is too precious to waste on formality. Dolores knew everything about everyone in the area, including Patrick Winslow, and she shared what she knew with the directness that Susan was coming to recognize as her defining characteristic. "Patrick Winslow is not like his brother," Dolores said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "Gerald was soft. Patrick is—" She paused, searching for the word. "Solid. He works cattle. He has done it since he was 14. He and Gerald did not see each other much in the last few years, different kinds of men, different lives. But Patrick loved his brother, I think, sent money when he could, and he loves those children. He always wrote them letters." "Letters?" Susan said. "Gerald would read them aloud at supper," Ellie said from the corner where she was working on a piece of embroidery. She had been listening, as children always listen, with the particular focus of someone who knows the conversation is about something important. Uncle Patrick's letters were always funny. He would write about the cattle and what they were thinking. He said one old steer named Abraham thought he was the president of the herd and bossed all the other cattle around. Thomas, who was lying on the floor drawing something with a stub of charcoal on a piece of brown paper, said without looking up, "Abraham the steer was very wise." Dolores met Susan's eyes across the table and both women smiled. "He will come home soon," Dolores said. "The drives usually end by early summer. It is already April, perhaps 6 or 8 more weeks." 6 or 8 weeks. Susan looked around the homestead, at the unfinished addition, the leaking roof above the bedroom corner, the gate on the chicken coop that hung at an odd angle, the wheat field that needed plowing and replanting because Gerald had never gotten around to it in the grief-struck months after Clara's death. 6 or 8 weeks. She would need every minute of it. She set to work with a thoroughness that surprised even herself. She found Gerald's tools in the barn, and with Bert Halsey's grudging assistance, she paid him back his $14 from the small reserve of cash she had brought with her, got the roof patched, and the chicken coop gate properly rehung. She turned over the kitchen garden and planted beans and squash and onions. She made friends with Biscuit the plow horse, who was large and amiable and surprisingly agreeable about being driven, and she plowed and replanted 3 acres of winter wheat that had died back too hard. She taught Ellie to bake bread and Thomas to gather eggs without chasing the chickens, and every evening she read to them from the small collection of books Gerald had kept on a shelf above the fireplace, mostly primers, and 1 volume of poetry that had clearly been Clara's, given the pressed flowers tucked between its pages. The days had a rhythm to them that Susan had not felt in her own life for years, perhaps ever. Robert Crawford had been an unhappy man who made the people around him unhappy, and before Robert there had been the boarding house, which was relentless work with no particular warmth, and before that her parents' farm in Missouri, which she had loved but left at 19 because a girl who wanted anything for herself had to leave the farm and make her own way. She had never had this particular quality of purposeful, useful, rooted daily life. She found, to her surprise, that she was not merely enduring it. She was happy. She did not let herself think about what would happen when Patrick Winslow came home. That was a conversation for another day. For now, she was needed, and being needed was enough. The weeks passed. May settled over the Kansas plains with warmth and the persistent smell of grass, and the occasional afternoon thunderstorm that sent the children diving under the bed and captained the dog under the kitchen table, where he would lie with his nose on his paws looking profoundly aggrieved. Susan would make tea during the storms, a luxury she had brought with her from Abilene, a small tin of good strong black tea, and she and Ellie and Thomas would sit together and listen to the rain drumming on the sod roof and the patched wooden addition. And sometimes Ellie would ask Susan about where she had come from, and Susan would tell her the farm in Missouri, the flat fields of corn and sorghum, her mother's kitchen with the big iron stove. The way the fireflies came up in the evenings in July like scattered sparks. Do you miss it? Ellie asked one afternoon in late May, while a slow, soaking rain moved across the plains and the whole world seemed to be the color of pewter and green. Sometimes, Susan said honestly, but I find that I miss the idea of it more than the place itself. It is the feeling of belonging somewhere that I miss. Ellie considered this with the profound seriousness of a 7-year-old philosopher. You belong here, she said finally. Thomas and I decided. Susan looked at the child, at her dark braided hair, her steady, clear eyes, her thin hands wrapped around her cup of warm milk, and felt something she was not quite ready to name settle quietly in her chest. Thank you, Ellie, she said. That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. It was Dolores who brought the news, riding up the track to the homestead one afternoon in early June on her dun mare with her hair loose under her hat, and her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who is deciding how to arrange information before delivering it. Patrick Winslow's drive is done, she said, coming into the kitchen and accepting a cup of coffee without being asked, which was how their friendship operated by now. They came into Abilene 4 days ago. I had it from the Reverend, who had it from Bert Halsey, who had it from someone in town. He knows about Gerald. He's been told. Susan set down her spoon very carefully. How long until he arrives? 4 days on horseback if he pushes, Dolores said. 6 or 7 if he doesn't. He'll know the children are being cared for. The sheriff sent word along the trail 2 months ago, but he doesn't know the details. She looked at Susan with her frank, assessing gaze. He doesn't know about you. Susan had been thinking about this moment for weeks. She had told herself, very sensibly and practically, that she would simply explain the situation to Patrick Winslow, ensure he was capable of caring for the children, help him settle the homestead accounts, and then leave. She had been thinking about where she might go next, perhaps further west, perhaps to one of the larger cattle towns, where a woman with her domestic skills could always find work. She had it all planned out very neatly in her head, and she had been very careful not to examine the feeling that settled over her every time she thought about leaving Ellie and Thomas behind. He will want to know who I am and why I am here, Susan said. I will explain it to him. Dolores regarded her with an expression that contained, Susan suspected, rather more insight than Susan was entirely comfortable with. "Yes," Dolores said, "you will explain it to him," and she said nothing more about it. Susan told the children that their uncle was coming, and the effect was immediate and remarkable. Thomas, who had been gradually emerging from his silent grief over the past 2 months into something approaching his former cheerful self, became almost incandescent with excitement, talking about his Uncle Patrick with the reverent enthusiasm of a child who has built someone into a legend through the loving testimony of letters and his father's stories. Ellie was quieter about it, but her hands shook slightly when she helped Susan put together a better supper than usual that evening, and Susan noticed without comment. She spent the days before his arrival getting the homestead into the best order she could manage. She finished mending the fence along the east field, whitewashed the interior walls of the main room, which had gone gray with smoke and time, got the vegetable garden firmly established, and arranged the few pieces of furniture with the instinct of a woman who understands that an orderly home conveys a kind of care that speaks louder than words. She did not think about why she was doing this so carefully. She did not examine the way her hands had begun to feel slightly uncertain in the hours before his expected arrival. She simply worked. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 6 days after Dolores brought the news, which meant he had pushed hard. Susan was in the kitchen garden when she heard Captain begin to bark, and then Thomas's voice from inside the house rise into a shout of pure joy. She straightened up from the bean rows, pushed her hair back under her bonnet, and turned. Patrick Winslow rode up the track on a big bay horse that was road-weary and dust-coated, and he himself was neither of those things in the way that she had expected. She had been expecting someone like Gerald as Dolores had described him, a solid, practical man, weathered and competent. And Patrick Winslow was certainly weathered and clearly competent. She could see it in the ease with which he sat his horse, in the way his eyes moved across the homestead in the same quick, assessing way that she herself had assessed it on arrival, taking inventory, calculating what was right and what wasn't. But he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair that needed cutting and a square jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that she noticed, and then told herself firmly she had not. He swung down from the horse in a single motion and was immediately knocked sideways by Thomas, who had launched himself off the porch step with complete confidence that his uncle would catch him, which Patrick did, catching him with practiced ease and swinging him up, holding him tight, and burying his face for a moment in the boy's dark hair with an expression that Susan saw for only a second before he got it under control. An expression of grief and relief and love so raw and unguarded that it felt like witnessing something private. Ellie came to the porch edge and stood there with her hands clasped, more cautious than her brother, watching. Patrick set Thomas down, and then he looked at Ellie, and something passed between them that did not need words. He opened his arms and she walked into them with a composed dignity that immediately dissolved the moment his arms came around her, and she let herself cry the way she had not quite let herself cry since Susan arrived, with her whole small body, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her uncle's dusty shirt. Susan stood at the edge of the garden and watched this, and felt it in her chest in a way that she was not going to examine right now. After a long moment, Patrick looked up over Ellie's head and saw her. His eyes held on her face for a beat that was perhaps a second longer than strictly necessary. Then he said, with a voice that was lower and more deliberate than she had expected, "You must be the woman from Abilene." "Susan Crawford," she said. She was aware that she had dirt on her hands and her apron, and that her bonnet was slightly crooked, and she decided none of that was worth worrying about. "I am sorry about your brother, Mr. Winslow." He was still holding Ellie, who had gotten a grip on herself, and was now wiping her face with her sleeve. He looked at Susan steadily, taking her in with the same frank assessment she had noticed when he first rode up, and she had the feeling that he was a man who did not say things he did not mean and did not pretend to things he did not feel, which meant that whatever came out of his mouth next would be the exact truth of what he was thinking. "The sheriff's letter said you came to bury him," Patrick said. "But that was 2 months ago." "He had already been buried when I arrived," Susan said. "But the children needed someone, so I stayed." Patrick looked at her for another moment. Then he looked down at Ellie, who was still tucked against his side. He looked at the house, at the whitewashed walls visible through the open door, at the mended fence, at the kitchen garden neat and green and growing. He looked at the barn where he could see that Biscuit had been recently groomed and that the door was properly hung. He looked back at Susan. "You've been running this place," he said. "I have been doing my best," Susan said. "You will want to look everything over and see what still needs doing. There is a list on the table inside." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "A list," he said. "Several lists," she said. "I find them useful." There was a pause in which something moved between them that was not quite definable but was certainly something. And then Ellie said, "Susan makes the best corn bread, Uncle Patrick. And she braids my hair like Mama used to." Patrick looked down at Ellie's neat plaits and then back up at Susan. And whatever was in his expression in that moment was complicated enough that Susan felt it necessary to turn back toward the garden and say, over her shoulder, "I will go get the supper started. You will be hungry from the road." She heard him behind her, tending to his horse, his voice low, and even as he spoke to Thomas, who was following him toward the barn, full of questions and chatter and the barely contained energy of a 5-year-old who has just gotten his uncle back. She stood at the kitchen stove and listened to the sound of them outside and felt the peculiar domesticity of the moment press in around her like warm air. She had planned firmly to explain things clearly to Patrick Winslow, help him get settled, and then leave within the week. That had been the plan. Over supper, corn bread and beans and the last of the smoked ham from Bert Halsey's gift, which Susan had been saving. Patrick asked her questions about the homestead with the focus of a man who was accustomed to taking responsibility and wanted to understand what he was taking on. She answered everything directly and honestly, showing him the list she had made of accounts, debts, repairs done and repairs still needed, the state of the livestock, the condition of the wheat fields. He listened without interrupting, studying the lists, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions that told her he had been running cattle operations for long enough to understand finance and land management, even if his expertise was in beef rather than crops. "Gerald left debts," Patrick said, looking at the account list. "Some," Susan said. $14 to Bert Halsey, which I have already settled. $12 outstanding at the mercantile in Harlow Creek. The homestead itself is clear. Gerald had the deed free and the land fees paid through the year. You settled Halsey's debt yourself," Patrick said, looking up at her. "It seemed the right thing to do at the time," Susan said. "Was holding a grudge, and grudges make bad neighbors." Patrick regarded her. The lamplight was warm and the children were in bed, and the house was very quiet except for Captain's soft snoring from his spot by the fire and the distant sound of something moving through the grass outside, a night bird, or the wind. "I'll pay you back," he said. "You do not need to. I'll pay you back," he said again, with a quiet finality that was not argument so much as the simple statement of how things were going to be. Susan looked at him across the table. He was cleaner than he had been on arrival. He had washed up at the pump while she was cooking, and he had shaved, which had done nothing to make him less distracting, which was a thought Susan immediately put firmly away somewhere she intended not to look. "All right," she said. There was a quiet that was not uncomfortable. He turned the account list over in his hands and then set it down. "You were planning to leave," he said. "It was not a question." "That was my intention," she said carefully. "What would you do? Where would you go?" "I would find work," she said. "I am a capable housekeeper and cook. There is always work for a capable woman." Patrick was looking at the table between them, not at her. "The children are going to have a hard time when you leave," he said. "Children are resilient," Susan said, which she believed completely and which did not at all address the fact that her own chest ached at the thought of it. Ellie cried for 3 weeks solid after her mother died, Patrick said. Gerald wrote me about it. Said she stopped eating for a while. He looked up then, and his gray-green eyes were very direct and very honest. She hasn't been crying since you came. Thomas has started talking again. Gerald's neighbor Frank Ransom told me when I stopped at his place on the way in, said those children look like themselves again for the first time since Clara passed. Susan said nothing. She was not sure what she was supposed to say. I'm going to ask you something, Patrick said, and I want you to understand it is a practical question between two people in a practical situation, and I am not trying to be anything other than direct about it. All right, Susan said slowly. Would you consider staying on, he said, properly, as a paid housekeeper? I can afford a wage, the drive paid well, and I've got savings. The children need someone and they have gotten used to you, and it's clear that you know what you're doing around this place. You would have your own room, the addition, when it's finished and full board. I would get the addition framed up properly within the month. Susan looked at him steadily. He was looking back at her with the same steady, contained expression he had been wearing since he arrived, a face that showed you exactly what it chose to show you and no more. A paid housekeeper, she said. Yes, he said. And what would become of that arrangement once the children are older, once they no longer need the same kind of care? Patrick seemed to consider this as a genuinely practical question, which perhaps it was. We would cross that bridge when we came to it, he said. Susan folded her hands on the table. She thought about the boarding house in Abilene. She thought about the rooms she could find in a cattle town, the work she could pick up, the careful, independent, solitary life she had been telling herself she wanted. She thought about Ellie's hands on her waist, and Thomas sharing his biscuit and Captain following her everywhere, and the kitchen garden green and growing, and the particular quality of the light here in the mornings, coming in through the east window across the wooden floor. I will stay, she said. For the children, Patrick nodded. For the children, he agreed, and neither of them elaborated on that. The weeks that followed were a renegotiation of the daily rhythms of the homestead. Patrick was up before dawn every morning and outside before Susan had the coffee started, and by the time she came out to the kitchen, he had already fed the livestock and assessed whatever the day's needs were with the same quiet, efficient thoroughness that she recognized in herself. They worked alongside each other with the practical ease of two people who understood work and respected it, and who were too sensible and too tired at the end of each day to spend energy on pretension. But they were not merely practical alongside each other. That was the thing that Susan had not quite accounted for. Patrick Winslow was funny, in the dry, quiet way of a man who does not perform his humor for an audience, but simply says things that are true and exact and occasionally devastating in their precision. The first time Susan laughed at something, he said a perfectly timed observation about Abraham the steer, whom Patrick had actually known personally, and whose presidential pretensions he described with a straight face and impeccable deadpan. She was so surprised by the quality of her own laughter that she put her hand over her mouth. Patrick looked at her with something that might, in better light, have been described as satisfaction. He was also patient with the children in a way that was not effortless but was deliberate. She could see him choosing it, making himself be present and calm even when he was clearly tired or preoccupied, sitting on the floor with Thomas and helping him with his drawings, reading to Ellie in the evenings in a voice that was lower and rougher than his speaking voice. He had a specific way of talking to Ellie that acknowledged her seriousness, her grief, her intelligence, and he had a specific way of talking to Thomas that acknowledged his energy and his occasional tendency to act before he thought, and Susan found herself watching him with the children and feeling something she did not immediately have a name for. She named it eventually in late June, when the days had grown long and golden, and the wheat was coming up properly, and Ellie had started laughing again with the full, careless, uninhibited laugh of a child who believes the world is safe. Susan was at the pump in the yard, drawing water in the early evening while the light went amber and long across the grass, and she thought suddenly and with complete clarity, I am happy here. Not surviving here. Not enduring here. Happy. And then she thought with the same absolute clarity, I do not want to leave. And then in the third of the three thoughts that seemed to arrive together like a sequence of dominoes, she thought, and that is not only about the children. She put that third thought away very firmly and carried her water inside. It was Dolores who said what needed to be said, because Dolores always did. She arrived one afternoon in July on her dun mare, drank her coffee, watched Patrick come in from the field and speak to Susan about the fence along the north boundary with the ordinary ease of two people who have developed a private shorthand of shared domestic life, and then watched him go back outside, and then looked at Susan with her dark, direct eyes. He looks at you, Dolores said. He does not, Susan said. Susan, Dolores said, in the tone of a woman who has known her friend long enough to dispense with gentle approaches, he looks at you the way a man looks at something he wants and is being very careful not to reach for. Susan said nothing. She was looking at the table. And you look at him the same way, Dolores said. I work for this family, Susan said. It would not be appropriate. You are a widow and he is a free man, Dolores said. On the frontier, appropriate is whatever is honest. Susan pressed her lips together. I do not know what he thinks of me, she said, which was more honest than she had intended to be. Dolores looked at her steadily. No, she agreed, but you could find out. She left shortly after, and Susan stood at the window and watched her ride away across the flat grass and thought about honesty and appropriate behavior and what exactly she was afraid of, and she was not able to answer that last question to her own satisfaction. The answer came to her in pieces over the following 2 weeks, in the small accumulations of ordinary life. The way Patrick took her cup from her hands and refilled it without asking when he could see she was busy and couldn't get up herself. The way he listened to her, not just heard her, but listened, with the same focused attention he gave everything he considered worth his time, which was fewer things than most men, but those things received his complete and serious regard. The evening he found her in the kitchen after the children were asleep, sitting with Gerald's book of poetry open in her lap, and Clara's pressed flowers scattered carefully across the table while she tried to figure out which flowers went with which poems, because Ellie had asked and Susan had decided she wanted to know, and he sat down across from her and picked up one of the pressed flowers and said, "What is this one?" "I think it's prairie clover," Susan said, "but I'm not certain." Clara would bring them in from the fields, Patrick said quietly. She had a way of seeing things that Gerald never had. He loved her for it. He turned the small dried flower between his fingers. She would have liked you. Susan looked up at him. He was looking at the flower, not at her, and in the lamplight his face had the quality of something very contained and very private, and she understood all at once that he was a man who had been carrying grief of his own, not just for Gerald, but the accumulated weight of a life spent moving from one cattle drive to the next, never staying in one place long enough to make anything permanent. And she understood that the question of whether she stayed was not simple for either of them. "What will you do with the homestead?" she asked. "Will you go back to the drives?" "No," he said. The word was immediate and definite. He looked up at her. "I am going to stay. Gerald bought this land and I am going to make something of it. He deserved that. The children deserve that." He paused. "I'm 31 years old. I have been sleeping under the stars for 13 years and I am done with it." Something in Susan's chest rearranged itself. "You could do it," she said. "The land is good. The wheat is coming well. If you put the south field to wheat and the east field to—" "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "You left lists." "I always leave lists," she said. He was looking at her. The lamplight was between them and the night outside the window was wide and dark and full of the sound of summer insects, and Patrick Winslow was looking at her with an expression that Susan recognized because she had seen it in the mirror recently, when she was being honest with herself. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said. "If I were to ask you—" He stopped. He set the pressed flower down on the table with the careful precision of a man who is choosing words. "I am not a man who is good at saying things that are not practical," he said. I would rather fix a fence than write a poem. That is generally useful, she said. But I find that there are some things that need saying whether or not a person is good at saying them, he said. He looked at her steadily. I do not want you to stay as the housekeeper. The room was very quiet. Susan could hear her own heartbeat, which seemed to have become unreasonably loud. Then in what capacity, she said carefully, would you want me to stay? The only one I can think of, Patrick said, that would make any sense, for either of us. A silence in which Susan Crawford and Patrick Winslow looked at each other across a table covered in pressed flowers and an open book of poetry in the lamplight of a sod house on the Kansas plains in the summer of 1879. And both of them understood exactly what was being said without saying it, and both of them felt the weight and the rightness of it settle around them like a hand coming to rest. You have known me for 2 months, Susan said. I have known you long enough, he said simply. I am not an easy person, she said. I make lists, I have opinions. I argued with the Reverend last Sunday about the proper interpretation of a Bible verse, and I believe I was right. I know, he said. I heard about it from 3 separate people. And you are asking anyway, she said. I am asking anyway, he said. Susan looked at him, this steady, quiet, honest man who had come home to find his life rearranged, and had accepted the rearrangement with a grace that she found more moving than any dramatic declaration. He had not asked her to be something she was not. He had not asked her to make herself smaller or simpler or more convenient. He had asked her, with the direct simplicity of a man who does not play games, to stay as herself in the fullest meaning of the word. Then yes, she said, I will stay. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and it was the simplest and most tremendous thing that had happened to her in a very long time. They did not rush. That was not who either of them was. They were practical people, and they had children to consider and a homestead to run and a community that would notice and have opinions, which communities in small frontier towns invariably did. But they also were not dishonest about it, which Susan appreciated. There was no pretending that nothing had been said. They moved through the ordinary days of the homestead with a new quality between them, still practical, still direct, but with an ease and a warmth that had not been there before, as if something that had been careful was now allowed to be natural. Patrick completed the addition. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sunday afternoons, and he was a better carpenter than Gerald had been, which was not difficult, but also a better carpenter than Susan had expected, which was pleasant. The addition got a proper floor and 2 windows, and a door that hung straight, and a roof that did not appear to harbor any ambitions about leaking. He did not say it was for anything specific, but when he finished it and they were both standing there looking at it, Susan said, "It will do very well as a bedroom," and Patrick looked at her sideways and said, "That was the idea." Dolers came to visit in August and took one look at the 2 of them and said, "Good," with the satisfaction of a woman whose assessment has been proven correct. "Nothing has been formally settled," Susan said. "It will be," Dolers said comfortably, and she was right. Patrick asked her properly on a Sunday evening in August, which was the same Sunday that Thomas had decided to name one of the new calves Abraham in honor of the legendary steer, a decision that had been reached with great ceremony and announced at supper. The children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Patrick came and stood in the kitchen where Susan was finishing the last of the washing up, and he said, without preamble and without decoration, "Susan Crawford, would you marry me?" Not quite a question. More like a statement that contained a question inside it, the way his speech often worked, as if he already knew what he thought and was simply inviting her to confirm or deny it. She turned around from the wash basin and looked at him. "I would," she said. "I would very much like to marry you, Patrick Winslow." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her, which was the first time he had kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that does not leave any questions about the feelings behind it, sure and warm and deeply attentive, the kiss of a man who does things properly when he does them at all. Susan put her hands against his chest, feeling the solid reality of him beneath her palms, and kissed him back with the full weight of 2 months of carefully restrained feeling, and thought, with the clear, ringing certainty of someone who has finally come home. Yes. This exactly. They told the children the next morning over breakfast. Thomas received the news by immediately asking whether this meant he could have a dog that was actually his and not just Captain, which everyone agreed did not address the point but was very Thomas. Ellie sat very still for a long moment, and then she looked at Patrick and then at Susan, and then she said quietly, "Is this what you want? Both of you?" "Really, really," Patrick said. "Then I am very glad," Ellie said, with 7-year-old solemnity, and she reached across the table and put her hand over Susan's in an exact echo of what Patrick had done with pressed flowers on the table 2 months ago, and Susan's eyes were suddenly so full of tears she had to look at the ceiling. Thomas observed all of this and then said, "Can we have pancakes?" And the general eruption of ordinary family life resumed. They were married in September, on a clear golden day that smelled of late summer grass and the particular sweetness of ripening wheat, by Reverend Moore in the Harlow Creek Church, with dolors as Susan's witness and old Bert Halsey, who had by now decided that Susan Crawford was the best thing that had ever happened to the Winslow property, and was prepared to be surprisingly sentimental about it, standing up with Patrick. The children were in the front pew. Thomas sat with his feet swinging because they did not reach the floor, and Ellie held herself very straight and very composed until the Reverend said, "Husband and wife," and then she let out a breath so deep it was almost a sob, and reached sideways and held Thomas's hand without looking at him. And Thomas, who was 5 and generally did not understand or have patience for solemn occasions, held her hand back with perfect instinct. Susan wore her best dress, which was the dark blue wool she had packed in her carpetbag in Abilene, the one that had traveled with her all this way, and she had ironed it the night before with the care of a woman who understands that some occasions deserve their due. Patrick wore a clean shirt and a dark coat that he had clearly pressed himself, and his hair was combed and he had shaved, and when she walked toward him down the aisle of that small plain church, he looked at her with the same expression she had seen briefly on the day he arrived. When he held Thomas and buried his face in the boy's hair, the open, unguarded, utterly honest face of a man who is feeling something enormous and is not trying to hide it. After the ceremony, the town did what small frontier towns do. It gathered. Me Colton had made a cake. Dolors had brought tamales. Frank Ransom and his wife had produced a fiddle and a willingness to play it, and by late afternoon there was dancing on the grass outside the church in the September sunlight, the kind of dancing that is less about elegance and more about joy, the wide, spinning, laughing kind. Patrick danced with Susan and then with Ellie, who took it very seriously and kept careful time with her feet. Thomas danced with no particular regard for music or partner, simply throwing himself in circles until he got dizzy and sat down heavily in the grass, at which point Captain appeared from nowhere and began washing his face, which Thomas thought was hilarious. Susan stood in the late afternoon light of that September day and looked at the circle of it all, the small church, the gathered neighbors, the fiddle music rising into the clear sky, Patrick catching her eye across the circle of dancers and giving her the particular slow, private smile that she was learning to read as his most honest expression. And she thought about the telegram and the carpetbag and the stage to Harlow Creek and the biscuits shared under a table and the pressed flowers and the list of accounts and all the small, ordinary, particular things that had accumulated into this. Her life, her real and actual life, the one that fit her like something made to measure. The first winter of their marriage was hard in the way that frontier winters always are. The Kansas plains in January are not forgiving, with the wind coming hard off the open land and the cold settling into the sod walls of the house, despite Patrick's careful weatherproofing. But hard winters have their own interior warmth when you are not facing them alone, and Susan had never in her life been so comprehensively not alone. The house was full of warmth and bread smell, and the sound of children and the low, even, deliberate voice of the man she had married. And on the evenings when the wind was particularly ferocious, and the temperature dropped below what was reasonable. They would all four crowd around the fireplace with Captain between the children and the lamp turned high, and Susan would read and Patrick would carve. He had discovered a gift for wood carving that surprised him. Small, precise animals in pine that accumulated on the mantelpiece, and the world outside could do whatever it pleased. Patrick was a good husband in all the ways that Susan had learned to value: steady, honest, hardworking, present. He was also good in the ways she had not expected, which were the ways that made her love him rather than simply respect him. He paid attention. He noticed things. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He noticed when something was on her mind and he did not push but let her come to it in her own time, and when she did come to it he listened with his whole attention. He argued with her when he thought she was wrong, which she respected entirely and told him so, and he argued without getting angry, which was a quality she had not previously encountered in a man, and which she found, upon reflection, remarkable. In February she told him she was expecting, and she told him in the kitchen on a morning in early February while the snow was still thick outside, and the light coming in the window had that particular flat white quality of winter on the plains. She said it directly, the way she said everything matter of fact, watching his face. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her, very carefully, with his arms around her and his chin against her hair, and he stood there for what felt like a long time without saying anything at all, which was exactly right, because there was nothing that needed to be said. "Are you pleased?" she said against his shoulder, because she already knew the answer but she wanted to hear it. "I'm the most pleased I have ever been about anything in my life," he said, with a simple honesty that was so complete she laughed, and felt him laugh too, and held on. She told Ellie and Thomas together at supper on a Friday evening when the week's work was done, and they were all at the table with the lamp burning and the fire high. Thomas received this news with an explosion of enthusiasm so complete and so absolute that he fell off his chair, which made everyone laugh including Thomas once he established he was not hurt. Ellie was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at Susan with those clear, steady eyes that were so like Patrick's in their directness, and said, "Will it be a brother or a sister?" "We do not know yet," Susan said. "I want a brother," Thomas said, from the floor where he had not yet gotten around to getting back up. "You have an opinion on the matter but no vote," Patrick told him. Spring came, and with it the particular fullness of a body doing something enormous and ordinary, and entirely its own business. Susan did not find pregnancy elegant, but she found it interesting, which was consistent with how she approached most things. She kept working, kept the house, kept the garden, kept the books, which she had taken over from Patrick by mutual agreement because she was better at it and they both knew it, at whatever pace her body allowed, which was slower than she would have preferred but faster than Patrick thought entirely wise. A disagreement they navigated with the good-natured friction of a marriage that is working properly. He was worried about her, which she found both touching and occasionally suffocating, and she told him so, and he said that was fair but he was going to worry anyway, and she said that was his right, and they arrived at the arrangement where she told him honestly when she needed help, and he trusted her to do so without hovering, which was the same honest arrangement they had with everything. The baby arrived in September, almost exactly 1 year to the day after their wedding, which Susan privately thought was the kind of symmetry that the universe occasionally offers as a gift. He was a boy, born in the early morning with dolors and the town midwife, Mrs. Abbott, in attendance, and he arrived with a fullness of lung and opinion that was immediately evident, and that Patrick, who had sat through the whole business on the other side of the door with Thomas asleep against his shoulder, and Ellie very much awake and holding his hand, found to be the most tremendous sound he had ever heard. They named him James Gerald Winslow, the first name for Susan's father and the second for Patrick's brother, and when Patrick first held him sitting on the edge of the bed while Susan watched his face, he looked down at this small, ferociously red, scrunched-up person and said, very quietly, "Hey there, James," in a voice so gentle it was barely above a whisper, and Susan put her hand on his arm and watched him fall immediately and completely in love. And felt the same thing happen to her all over again, watching it happen to him. Thomas was allowed in to see the baby first because he had been awake the longest. He stood beside the bed and looked at James with an expression of profound scientific interest, and then said, "He is very small," in the tone of someone noting a design flaw. "You were very small," Susan said. "I grew," Thomas said with evident satisfaction. Ellie came in more quietly, and she stood for a moment just looking. Then she looked at Susan and at Patrick and at the baby, and something moved across her 8-year-old face that Susan recognized as the expression of a child who is cataloging something to remember, storing it away in the particular place where the things that matter are kept. "His name is James Gerald," Ellie said. "Yes," Patrick said. "After Papa," she said. "After your papa," Patrick said. Ellie nodded. She reached out one careful finger and touched James's hand, and James, with the reflexive wisdom of the newly born, closed his tiny fingers around her finger and held on. Ellie looked up at Susan with eyes that were bright. "He already likes me," she said. "He has excellent taste," Susan said. The years moved the way years do when they are good, quickly, in the way of things that are not being endured, and with the particular texture of a life that is fully lived. James Gerald Winslow was followed 3 years later by a second son, William, who arrived in the summer of 1882 with less drama than his brother, and immediately proved himself the most amiable human being in the household, a quality he maintained consistently throughout his early childhood, and that stood in cheerful contrast to James, who had opinions about everything and expressed them at volume. The homestead grew. Patrick bought the adjacent quarter section when it came available in 1881, and the wheat operation expanded. He hired 2 hands, Tom Garrett, who was young and good with horses, and a man named Ernesto who had come north from Texas, and whose knowledge of cattle and land management was extensive and valuable, and who brought his wife Maria, who was Dolar's second cousin, and who therefore wove herself into the fabric of Susan's life with the comfortable inevitability of a woman who has been expected. Harlow Creek grew too, in the way that frontier towns were growing throughout those years. More people, a proper school, a second church, a doctor's office that finally replaced the aging Doc Fielding's setup in the back of the hardware store. Ellie was among the first students at the new school, and she was good at everything she studied with the focused determination of a girl who has decided she is going to understand the world. And Susan made sure she had books and encouraged every question and argued with the schoolteacher, a Mr. Farley, about the adequacy of the education being offered to girls specifically. An argument she did not win with Mr. Farley, but which she pursued to such effect that within 2 years, the curriculum for girls in Harlow Creek was substantially expanded. Patrick attended this campaign with the quiet, unshowy support that was characteristic of him, not standing up in meetings himself, because he thought Susan made the arguments better than he could and he was right, but driving her to those meetings and making sure the children were fed and managed, and that supper was ready when she got home, and sitting up late sometimes to hear how it had gone, and asking the kind of questions that told her he had been thinking about it seriously even when she wasn't there. Thomas grew into himself steadily and with a considerable amount of noise. He was 10 years old and already clear about the fact that he wanted to work with horses, a preference that Patrick accommodated by teaching him everything he knew about horses, which was considerable. Thomas had his father Gerald's gentle eyes and his mother Clara's quick hands and some quality entirely his own, a gift for animals, for getting their trust, for understanding what they needed, and by the time he was 12 he was the best young horseman in the county, a fact that was recognized and mentioned by enough people that Thomas was in some danger of becoming insufferably pleased about it, a tendency that Patrick managed by giving him more chores. The homestead was whole and solid, and working by the time the decade turned. 1880 became 1881 became 1882, and each year the wheat came better and the herd of cattle Patrick had been building came larger, and the house that had been a two-room sod structure with an unfinished addition was now a proper frame house of 6 rooms with a real wood floor and glass windows, and a proper kitchen range that Susan had ordered from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, which arrived in parts and took Patrick and Ernesto a full 2 days to assemble, and which Susan then proceeded to use with the comprehensive authority of someone who has been waiting for proper equipment their whole life. The neighbors had long since stopped treating Susan as a newcomer or an oddity. She was Mrs. Winslow now, which was simply who she was, the woman who ran the Winslow place with the precision of someone who does not accept nonsense from weather or livestock or accounts, who braided her daughter's hair and argued with school boards and made the best corn bread in the county, and was one of the 3 women you called if someone needed help, any kind of help, at any hour. She was also, increasingly and without particular drama, Patrick's partner in every sense that the word could carry. They ran the farm together. They raised the children together. They argued occasionally about practical matters. She thought the south field should go to sorghum and he thought wheat. They split the south field and each planted half, and she was right, which she mentioned, and he said that was fair, which was how they always settled it. They read in the evenings and talked in the dark before sleep, the long, slow, rambling conversations of 2 people who have made a life together and find each other genuinely interesting still, after years of it. She loved him with the solid, deep, unsentimental love that does not need to announce itself, that is woven into the ordinary days rather than reserved for special occasions. She loved him when he was patient with the children, and when he was tired and short-tempered and came and found her afterward and said, with characteristic directness, "I was short with Thomas today for no good reason, and I am sorry about it." She loved him at supper when he made some perfectly deadpan observation that sent the children into fits of laughter. She loved him on Sunday mornings when he sat on the porch in the early light before anyone else was up, drinking his coffee and looking out across the wheat fields with the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and is quietly and daily grateful for it. She told him once, on an evening in the summer of 1882, when William was a new baby and James was a demanding toddler, and the older children were growing into the particular interesting complexity of older childhood, and the farm was full, and the house was warm, and her life was as complete as she had ever imagined a life could be. She told him directly, which was the only way she knew how to say anything, "I want you to know that I am happy, not just content. Genuinely and completely happy, Patrick. I wanted to say it plainly because I think it is important to say." He had put down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table where they sat in the late evening quiet, and his expression had that quality that she had loved from the beginning, the complete, unguarded, honest face of a man who is not performing anything. "I know," he said. "I can see it." "Then you should also know," she said, "that it was you who made the difference, not just the children, not just the homestead, you." The silence that followed was the very good kind. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said. "Come here," he said. She got up and went around the table, and he pulled her into his lap with the easy confidence of a man in his own house with his own wife, and held her with his arms around her waist while she leaned her head against his shoulder. And outside the window the summer night was wide and soft and full of stars, and somewhere further down the track old Captain, gray-muzzled now, still following Susan wherever she went, was barking at something in the grass, and then falling quiet again. In the autumn of 1883, Ellie turned 11 and announced with complete composure that she intended to go to the normal school in Salina when she was old enough and train as a teacher. She said this at supper with the directness that she had absorbed over years of watching Susan and Patrick interact, and Patrick said, without a moment's hesitation, "All right," and Susan said, We will find out what the requirements are, and Thomas said, "Who is going to braid your hair if you go to Selena?" And Ellie threw a biscuit at him, which technically broke a household rule but which Patrick elected not to address on this particular occasion. There were hard things because there always are. The winter of 1883 was brutal, the worst in years, the kind of winter that the plains could produce with a particular savage efficiency, where the cold came in for weeks at a stretch, and the cattle suffered, and there were days when venturing outside to the barn was a genuine act of bravery. One of the hired hands got lost in a January blizzard between the main house and the barn, and was found by Patrick 3 hours later in a bad state, frostbitten and confused, and was taken in and nursed through the worst of it by Susan over the following week, with the focused, practical care that she gave to everything that needed doing. The following spring, Dolores Vega sold her ranch and announced she was going to Santa Fe, where her sister lived and where, she said, the winters did not attempt to kill you as a matter of course. Susan drove to Dolores' ranch the day before she left, and they sat together in Dolores' kitchen for the last time and drank coffee and talked, really talked, the way they had been talking for 4 years, and at the end of it, they held each other the way women do when a friendship has been a true and weight-bearing thing in each other's lives. "You are a different woman from the one who got off that stage with a carpetbag," Dolores said. "I am the same woman," Susan said, "only more myself." "That is what I said," Dolores said, with her dark, level eyes and the edge of a smile. Dolores left, and Susan missed her with the particular ache of losing a friend who has known you from the beginning, who was there at the moment when things changed, who carries a piece of your story that no one else holds. But Harlow Creek had grown enough by then that there were other women. Susan was close to Maria, Ernesto's wife, who had become genuinely dear to her, the doctor's wife, Helen, the formidable Mrs. Elspeth Carver, who had moved to the area in 1881 and who ran the subscription library out of her front parlor, and with whom Susan had a rich, regular, argumentative relationship about books that both of them entirely enjoyed. Life in Harlow Creek in those years was not simple. The plains were not a simple place. There were the hard realities of drought years and prairie fires, and the grinding economic pressures on small farming operations that were subject to the whims of commodity markets, that operated far away in cities that had no interest in the individual human story of a wheat farmer in Kansas. There were the continuing, deeply unjust realities of how indigenous peoples of the region were being treated, the systematic displacement and confinement of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, who had lived on these plains for generations, and who were being pushed off their lands by the same expansion that had brought Susan and Patrick to Harlow Creek. Susan saw and acknowledged this injustice, which not everyone around her did, and she did not look away from it, though she was honest with herself about the limits of what she could do within the structures of the world she inhabited. But the injustices of the world did not stop the ordinary life of the Winslow homestead from being real and full and good. The wheat grew. The children grew. The cattle operation grew, slowly and solidly, into something that would sustain the family for years. James grew into a fierce, smart, opinionated little person who was his mother's son in every particular, and who argued with everyone about everything with a confidence that Patrick said probably ought to be moderated, and that Susan privately found magnificent. William grew into a sunny, cheerful, agreeable child who somehow managed to be everyone's favorite and to not be at all insufferable about it, which was a rare gift. It was on a warm evening in the late spring of 1884, when James was nearly 3, and William was 1.5, and the older children were out in the yard still in the long summer light, and Patrick was on the porch with his coffee and the particular stillness that meant he was thinking something through, that Susan came and sat beside him and said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. In 5 years of marriage, those words delivered in that tone could mean several different things, and he had learned to wait and see which one it was. "I think about the telegram sometimes," she said. The one from Gerald asking for someone to come. I think about how I almost did not come. Almost went to Topeka instead. I had it half in my mind to go to Topeka. Patrick was quiet, watching her. If I had gone to Topeka, she said, I would be somewhere else entirely, some other life, some other arrangement. And these, she paused, and the gesture she made encompassed all of it, the yard and the children and the house and the fields and the evening light and him. None of this would have happened. But you did not go to Topeka, Patrick said. No, she said. I came here. Why? He said. Not challenging, just asking, with the genuine curiosity that was one of his qualities she had come to treasure, that he was still interested in the answers, even after all this time. Susan thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. I think, she said slowly, that I was empty enough to be moved in any direction the wind wanted to take me, and the wind took me here. But then I found the children and they needed me and I needed to be needed, and then she stopped. And then, he prompted softly. And then you came home, she said simply, and it turned out this was where I was going all along. Patrick set down his coffee cup. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had reached across a table covered in pressed flowers years ago, with the same quiet certainty. I came home, he said, to a different life than I expected. Was it? She started. It was everything, he said. Everything I did not know how to want before I had it. The evening settled around them, warm and golden and smelling of grass and coming summer, and from the yard they could hear Thomas's voice, raised in some kind of argument with James that had the good-natured edge of something that would resolve itself without tears, and Ellie's voice, calm and reasoned, mediating in a manner that already sounded remarkably like the teacher she intended to become. William, who was not old enough to be involved in the argument but who did not intend to be left out of anything, was making his views known in the wordless but emphatic manner of a toddler with opinions. Captain came and put his gray muzzle on Susan's knee, and she rested her hand on his head, and the dog sighed with the deep contentment of one who has followed the right person to the right place and is at peace with every decision. What are you thinking? Patrick said, watching her. I am thinking, Susan said, that I am the most fortunate woman in Kansas. In Kansas, he said with the exact deadpan that still, after all these years, made her laugh. In the whole of the American continent, she said. That is better, he said, and brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the direct, unhurried way he had of doing things that mattered, not theatrical, not performed, just true, and her whole chest was full of the warmth of it. Ellie did eventually go to Salina for the normal school in the fall of 1888, when she was 16, which was young but which the school allowed because her exam results were exceptional, and her composure in the interview was, according to the admissions committee, remarkable for a girl her age. Susan drove her to the stage with Thomas driving and Patrick beside her on the seat, and they stood together on the street in Harlow Creek and watched the stage pull away, and Susan kept her chin up and her face steady until the stage rounded the bend, and then she put her face in Patrick's shoulder for exactly 1 minute and then straightened up and said, "She will write every week. I told her she must." "She will," Patrick said. "She is a great deal like her stepmother." Susan looked at him sideways. In all the years since her marriage, she had not applied that word to herself, stepmother. The children had called her Susan always, which was natural and right, and she had thought of herself as their caretaker and their person but had not fixed a name to it. "Is that what I am?" she said. "You are what you are," Patrick said quietly. "The word is just a word. The thing itself is what matters." She nodded. The word was just a word. The thing itself, the braided hair and the shared biscuit and the stories by the fire and the years of daily, ordinary, magnificent love was what mattered. The thing itself was everything. Thomas turned 18 in 1890, and by then he was fully established as the best horseman in the county, and was in the process of negotiating with the Randall Ranch, the largest operation in the area, about a position as a horse trainer, which he got, and which Patrick supported entirely, and which Susan managed being proud of with characteristic efficiency, packing him a proper kit, and writing him a list of sensible household management advice, which he rolled his eyes at and took with him. James, at 9, was already reading at a level that was causing the Harlow Creek schoolteacher to write notes home about his potential, and whether the family had considered more advanced educational opportunities. Notes that Susan answered with precise, detailed letters about the specific books James was already reading at home, and questions about the adequacy of the school's library, which energized another campaign of Susan's that ended with the school acquiring a substantially improved selection of books, funded partly by subscription and partly by a very pointed letter to the county school board. William, at 8, was the child who had somehow gotten all the temperamental ease that none of his siblings possessed in quite the same supply, and who made friends with everyone he met, and who was already, in his quiet, amiable way, the person who held the social fabric of the household together. The one who noticed when James was in a bad mood and needed space, or when Patrick was tired and needed his coffee without being talked at, or when Susan had had a long week and what she needed was for someone to make her laugh, which William had an effortless gift for. In the spring of 1891, the letter came from Ellie. Not the usual weekly letter. This one was different, a longer letter, written with the careful handwriting she had developed at normal school, and it contained, along with her usual news about her studies and her friends, a rather careful account of a young man named Arthur Beaumont, who taught history at the Selina School, and who had apparently been walking with her on Sunday afternoons for the past 2 months, and who had asked her father's permission to write formally, which she was now informing Patrick of in advance, so as to prepare him, which was very Ellie. Susan watched Patrick's face as he read this letter aloud at supper, because he did not read it aloud initially, and she suspected what it contained from the particular quality of his expression, so she asked him to read it to the family. He read it with the careful, measured delivery of a man who is choosing his reactions deliberately, and when he was done there was a silence. "Arthur Beaumont teaches history," Thomas said, who was home for a visit. "Is he any good?" "Ellie would not write about him if he were not worth writing about," Susan said. Patrick folded the letter. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, with the slight roughness that was the only indication of feeling he usually allowed himself, "She is 17. "She is nearly 18, Susan said, "and she is writing to tell you which is right. That is her being courteous and honest, the way she was raised." Patrick looked at her across the table. In his expression there was the specific complicated mixture that any parent of a daughter carries when the world comes for her pride and grief and protectiveness, and the hard, necessary work of letting go. "She sounds happy," he said. "She sounds very happy," Susan agreed. He picked up the letter and folded it again and put it in his breast pocket, where Susan suspected it would reside for quite some time. He wrote to Arthur Beaumont the following week, a letter that Ellie later reported Arthur had read with great care and some nervousness, and that had contained very little in the way of explicit threat, but had made extremely clear what kind of man Patrick Winslow was, and what his expectations were in relation to the treatment of his daughter, which Arthur, Ellie said, had received with complete respect, and had apparently told her he found very reassuring, since it told him clearly what kind of family he was hoping to become part of. Susan, upon hearing this, thought that she liked Arthur Beaumont already. The summer of 1892 brought a drought that was hard on the wheat but not catastrophic, because Patrick had by then diversified enough that the cattle operation partially offset the crop loss, and because he and Susan had built up enough reserve in the good years to carry them through a difficult season, which was the product of all those carefully kept accounts and the lists that Susan had been maintaining since the very first week she arrived, and which now constituted a detailed financial history of the farm spanning more than a decade. The drought was hard, but they came through it, and coming through hard things together had its own quality, a deepening, a strengthening, a renewed gratitude for the ordinary days when things were going well. Ellie came home that summer to help, and she brought Arthur Beaumont with her, with proper arrangements made for his accommodation with the Ransom family down the road. Arthur Beaumont was a quiet, precise, thoughtful young man of 22, who looked at Ellie with the particular expression that Susan recognized with a rush of tenderness, and who helped with the hay baling without being asked, and who sat up late with Patrick discussing land management and the history of Kansas frontier policy with equal engagement, and who helped James with his Latin after supper, which James did not require, but accepted with the seriousness he applied to all educational opportunities. Patrick took Susan aside on the third evening of Arthur's visit and said, in the direct way that she had loved about him for 13 years now, "I like him." "I know," Susan said. "He is a good man." "He is a very good man," Susan agreed. "I'm going to have to let her go," Patrick said, and the way he said it was not complaint but simply the honest acknowledgement of what is true. "She has already become who she is," Susan said gently. "You and Gerald and Clara and me, I hope you made her into someone who can go and go safely because she is solid all the way through. You do not lose her, you just expand." Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You always know how to say a thing." "Someone in this marriage has to," she said, and he laughed, and the tension of the moment broke into the ordinary warmth of the two of them standing together in the evening light outside their own house, on their own land, in their own life. Arthur Beaumont and Ellie Winslow were married the following spring, in the same Harlow Creek church where Patrick and Susan had been married 14 years before. Susan sat in the pew with James on one side and William on the other, and watched Ellie walk down the aisle with Patrick's arm through hers, and she thought about the little girl with the rag doll sitting by a window with the blankness of prolonged grief, and the way she had unfolded over the years into this composed, clear-eyed, beautiful young woman who braided her own hair with the same pattern Susan had first put there, who was going toward a life of her own, choosing with her chin up and her eyes open and her heart full. Patrick delivered his daughter into the hands of her husband with the quiet grace of a man who has learned to carry his feelings without making them a burden on others, and then he came and sat beside Susan, and she took his hand under the edge of her skirt, not for anyone else's benefit, but because that was what the moment required. The preacher spoke. The fiddle played after, because of course it did, in the same field where they had danced at Susan and Patrick's wedding, and this time it was Patrick who pulled Susan onto the grass and danced with her in the same wide, spinning, laughing way, and she let herself be spun, and the late spring light was gold and long, and the smell of grass and blossoms was everywhere, and James and William chased each other around the edges of the dancing crowd, and Thomas, who had made the trip from the Randall Ranch for the occasion, danced with Maria's youngest daughter with the focused determination of someone who has identified a situation he intends to pursue. Old Captain had died in the winter of 1889, quietly and with dignity, in his spot by the fire, and Susan had cried in a way she didn't entirely explain to anyone, because Captain had been part of the beginning, part of the story of how things became what they were. But by the time of Ellie's wedding, there was a younger dog, a red hound named Lincoln, who had exactly the same ambitions as Captain had, namely to follow Susan everywhere, and who could be found underfoot in the kitchen at all hours, a situation Susan claimed to find inconvenient, and which she clearly and absolutely did not. In the years that followed, the Winslow homestead continued to be what it had become, a working farm and a working family in the fullest sense of both words, an ongoing, changing, daily fact. James went to study in Lawrence in 1895, 18 years old and ferociously intelligent, and ready to argue with every professor he encountered, which he did, and who also wrote home every week with the same regularity that Ellie had once written from Salina, long detailed letters full of ideas and arguments and the occasional plea for Susan's cornbread recipe, which she sent, annotated in her clear handwriting with notes about altitude adjustments and the proper calibration of a wood stove. William stayed. He was the child who stayed, not because he had to or because he lacked ambition, but because the land had gotten into him the way it gets into some people and holds them, and he had a gift for it, for the growing things, for the weather reading, for the animals, for the whole complex, demanding, beautiful business of making a farm work. He worked alongside Patrick with the easy competence of someone who has been learning since childhood, and gradually, year by year, took on more until the farm was run as a partnership between the two of them, with Susan's accounts and management holding the whole thing together. It was William who told them, one evening in the fall of 1897, that he intended to marry a girl named Beatrice Halsey, Bert Halsey's granddaughter, a connection that Susan found deeply satisfying in its circularity, given that old Bert had been the first neighbor to show up at the homestead all those years ago with a smoked ham and a grudge. William, who was 24, delivered this information at supper with his characteristic good-natured calm, and Patrick said, "Good," with equal calm, and Susan said, "Tell me about her." And William told them everything, thoroughly and honestly, for a considerable time. Beatrice Halsey came to supper the following Sunday, and was everything William had said, a capable, warm, clear-eyed young woman who had grown up in the county, and knew the land and the work, and who looked at William with the expression that Susan had learned, by now, to recognize immediately, and always with a full heart. Patrick and Susan sat on the porch after Beatrice left, in the evening quiet that had become the natural territory of the two of them in the years when the house was more often quiet than full. "Another good one," Patrick said. "William has good judgment," Susan said. "He always has." "Comes from good raising," Patrick said, in the simple, direct way that he said things that were true. Susan looked at him. He was 52 now, and the years had done the things that years do: more gray at his temples, more lines at the corners of his gray-green eyes, a quality of weight and ease about him that was the particular combination of hard work and contentment settling into a body over decades. He was still the most honest person she had ever known. He was still funny, in exactly the same dry, quiet way. He still got up before dawn, and she still had the coffee on before he came in from the morning chores, and they still sat across from each other at the kitchen table in the early light, neither of them speaking much, both of them simply present, which was the most intimate thing she had ever known. "Patrick," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember the first day you came home?" she said. "To the homestead after the drive." "I remember," he said. "You saw the lists," she said, "and you asked me if I was serious, and I said I was entirely serious." "I remember," he said again, with the suggestion of a smile. "I want you to know," she said, "that I have been entirely serious about all of it. Every day, every single thing." The silence between them had the quality of something very complete. He took her hand the way he always did, quietly, without ceremony, with the certain and absolute intention of someone who intends to keep holding on. "I know," he said. "So have I." The autumn evening spread wide around them, the Kansas plains going gold and deep blue under the last of the light, the wheat fields hushed, the cattle moving at the far edge of the south pasture, Lincoln the red hound asleep at Susan's feet, the house warm and lit behind them where William had stayed to help with the dishes, and where, if you were very quiet, you could still hear the particular sounds of a house that has been fully inhabited for years. The creak of the floorboards, the tick of the stove, the small, domestic sounds of a life built carefully and loved completely, and carried forward into the world by the people it had made. Susan Crawford had arrived in Harlow Creek with a carpetbag and a borrowed sense of purpose, to bury a stranger and tend to children who needed tending, and she had found instead the life she had not known how to imagine for herself, rooted and real and full of the particular substance of daily love, the kind that does not announce itself but is simply there, steady and warm and endlessly present, like the light on the Kansas plains in the morning, arriving without ceremony and illuminating everything. Patrick Winslow had come home to a different life than he had left, and it had turned out to be the only life he had ever truly wanted. They sat together in the gathering dark, hand in hand, and the stars came out one by one above the quiet plains, and the night settled over the homestead like a blessing, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left wanting, nothing left undone. Only the good, ongoing, irreplaceable fact of two people who had found each other by the particular grace of a telegram and a carpetbag and a prairie wind blowing west, and who had made of that finding the most important thing either of them would ever do.